not native, but that was introduced by people, so it was brought here somehow. It's introduced a lot of different kinds of ways on purpose or by accident. And once it's introduced, it's able to establish itself, grows wildly out of control, and has a negative impact on the environment, on human health, on our economy, pretty much anything that you care about. I bet you an invasive species is negatively impacting it somewhere. So, do you see the background of this picture here?
Yes, I do.
Do you know, can you see what that is? It's not ivy, it's similar to ivy. What is this lump here? What's under that lump? It's a barn. And these are all giant trees growing behind the barn, and they're all being covered by a plant called kudzu. And here's a picture of its flower. It makes a beautiful flower that apparently smells just like grape Kool-Aid. And this is on this is on the early detection list for Oregon. We don't have it in Oregon yet, but if you ever find this plant in Oregon, we ask that you call 1-866-INVADER or go to OregonInvasivesHotline.org to report it, because we really don't want it here. That's an invasive species. Okay, so looking at this slide, this sort of summarizes it in plant definitions. A lot of times when you talk about plants, lots of words float around like weed, non-native, invasive, non-indigenous, alien, exotic, and there's lots of different kinds of definitions that people would use to describe invasive species. So if you imagine that this green box here are all the plants in Oregon, and inside the circle are all the non-native plants, and the green area are all the native plants. So believe it or not, we actually do have a lot of non-native species in Oregon, and that includes a lot of beneficial species that we just talked about, like crops, pasture, forestry species, ornamentals that we depend on. And then, however, a very small portion of those non-natives actually are become weeds. So how would you define a weed? That's the definite term for you guys. What's a weed? It could take nutrition from other plants. It grows rapidly. It's all of those things, but essentially it's a very general term for a plant we don't like. We don't want it there. It's in a place we don't want it. Plant growing where we don't want it to grow. It could be a native species. See, it's overlapping with the green there. Lots of native species are quite weedy. Yeah.
Well, we don't want any of the non-native ones, so why wouldn't all the non-native ones be considered weeds?
They're not. The red circle, those are the weeds.
Well, I know, but that's what I'm saying. Why wouldn't the whole white circle be considered a weed? Because we don't. You said it's just that we don't want.
Not actually non-native species. There's lots of species we do want that we use every day, like corn, wheat, potatoes, tulips, oranges, anything that is not native to this region.
I get it.
Yeah, and actually, can you guys guess what percentage of non-native species actually that are able to establish themselves actually become invasive?
Probably not. I'll try. 36.
Yeah. Only 1%. Very, very few. Actually, to be precise, of all the species that are introduced accidentally or on purpose, only 10% of those are able to establish and grow. And then only 10% of those become invasive. So 10% of our non-natives can become invasive. And so we have a weed, that's a plant at a place. A plant growing where you don't want it, like a dandelion. Dandelions, however, don't invade our forests and disrupt our ecosystems. Now, there's also something called, that's an invasive species, noxious weed. So what's a noxious weed?
Bad for us.
Yeah, it's bad for us. It's bad for the environment. It's a term that's used by the state of Oregon. That's a regulatory designation. So basically, that means that Oregon Department of Agriculture reviewed that plant and decided that it's an illegal plant to have in Oregon, sell, transport, or it's just illegal to have it. It's a noxious weed. And oftentimes, noxious weeds are poisonous, or they directly affect agriculture. That's one reason why they might be listed, but they're not necessarily harmful to wildlands. So, can you think of any examples of noxious weeds? We have 100 of them. The Oregon Department of Agriculture, 100 weeds that are noxious weeds.
Marijuana.
Which one?
Wait, marijuana is not
Ivy, yeah.
No.
Ivy is a noxious weed, so that one. Basically, what it means is that now nurseries can't sell ivy anymore. It's illegal for them to sell ivy, even though it's such a popular garden plant. It's been listed as noxious, so it's illegal to have it.
What about?
Any others?
I'm not sure the name, but I'm gonna guess like it's water hemlock or something.
Poison water hemlock?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's on the list. I don't remember exactly. You know, you could list your Armenian blackberry, yellow flag iris, cheatgrass. I know you guys have talked about those plants. Those are all noxious weeds. Now, finally, invasive. What is an invasive species? It's slightly different from noxious. See, it's not totally overlapping the other circles. A lot of invasive species are weeds, and a lot of invasive species are noxious weeds, but they're not all. There are some species that are considered invasive, but are not on the noxious weed list. There's even some native species, see that's overlapping with the green, that can be considered invasive. However, that's debatable. Some people really don't like that idea. Like they don't ever want you to call a native species invasive. But anyways, invasive species means that it spreads outside of cultivation and causes environmental and economic harm. We just went over that definition. And then natives is endemic species or our natural heritage. So those species that have been in Oregon forever, and we associate with what it means to be an Oregonian and what we see in our native ecosystems. Okay, so what are some characteristics of invasive species? Why are these things so able to grow out of control and go crazy and take over the environment and cause so much trouble? What do they do? They reproduce very fast. Yeah. They have high reproductive capacity, so they grow fast. They germinate early in the year. They mature very quickly. They produce seeds early in the year, and the seeds broadcast widely and then can disperse. This is a noxious weed. This is also an invasive species. This is garlic mustard, and it is almost done. Like it's cut off right here because it was producing flowers and seeds, and I of course didn't want it to go to seed because it's a very dangerous invasive species actually, and we don't have any of it in Lane County yet. So I'd be very, very sad if I was responsible for its introduction. So I cut off the flowers right away. But this is this plant that germinates, is one of the first things to germinate in the spring, produces thousands of seeds. The seeds remain viable in the soil for 5 to 10 years. If you pull it, it just germinates more seeds. It's very difficult to control. And then the seeds are they very easily spread. They'll attach to your socks and your shoes and your animals and your equipment, and it's so easy to spread them through the environment from one place to another, by animals or by people. And also so that's a good way to phrase it. You could say they can spread by biotic means and abiotic means, if you use those terms. Biotic ways they spread would be by attaching to people and being spread by animals and people as they move through the environment. What are some abiotic ways that seeds can spread or root fragments can spread? Wind and water, yeah. So if garlic mustard were growing next to a creek and the seeds go into the water is going to disperse it downstream. Or if you think of dandelions, the way the seeds are blown to the wind. That's the abiotic ways. So one question that people often ask with invasive species, actually it's a very interesting research topic. A lot of scientists are interested in studying invasive species because if you think about it, it doesn't really make any sense. Here you have an organism that's not native to this environment and coming in and out-competing our native species. If you think about our native species, they're adapted to this environment. They have been evolving in this environment, creating relationships with other species. They should have the advantage, right? They've been here forever. How is it that some species from another environment can come in and actually have the advantage? So it's a little bit of a difficult research question to understand, and we're still trying to understand it. But one of the theories is that basically what you do is it's like pipetting a species out of its environment all by itself, extracting it from all of those interactions that it has in its native range, all of the predators that prey on it, all the things it normally preys on, the habitat it usually lives in, and putting it into a totally new environment where it doesn't have any of those relationships anymore. And so oftentimes plants co-evolve relationships with predators that prey on them. Why do you think roses have thorns?
Stuff doesn't need it.
Yeah, to prevent grazers from grazing it. And so you have this evolution of the predator-prey dynamic where the rose grows a thorn, the grazer evolves a way to eat around the thorns, and then the rose evolves an even bigger thorn, and they have this dynamic to try to prevent the grazer from getting it. Well, you take that rose away from that predator, it no longer has something grazing on it, and it can grow like mad. It doesn't have anything holding it back anymore. And so that's what we think with invasive species is because they don't have those natural predators, they're able to just explode. And that is why people have actually tried to control them by introducing their natural predators back into this environment again. Do you guys know what that's called? It's a special kind of plant control that's been very popular recently. You might have heard about them going wrong, like in Australia when introducing a predator or a prey to control the invasive species. So if you have the rose and it's going crazy, why don't we just introduce the deer that was grazing on it to help control it? Well, that's exactly what we do actually. It's called biological control. And what scientists do is they introduce the insects or other organisms that prey or graze on the plant as a form of control. It's actually been very successful in some cases. It's called biocontrol. So another characteristics is that these species are not picky at all. They will live anywhere. They'll grow anywhere. They can tolerate a lot of different kinds of environments. And so it's not like they're specialists. They don't need a specific pH. They don't need sun or shade. They can tolerate wet or dry conditions, nutrients or poor nutrient soils. They're called generalists. A lot of our native species that have evolved to special environments are called specialists. And they absolutely need those characteristics, those conditions to survive. Invasive species are not specialists. And then they're very difficult to control. So once you have it in an environment, it's almost impossible to get rid of. So that's one characteristic. And then, and I'll have an example of this, but oftentimes we say, oh, invasive species, they cause lots of environmental damage. They will change the ecosystem, or they'll outcompete another species and reduce biodiversity in a certain area. And we blame the invasive species for the damage we're seeing. However, in some cases, the invasive species is there because another thing happened in the environment that weakened the environment a little bit, made it more easy to invade, or changed it so that the environment has the advantage. One example would be, well, I'll give you an example from my research when I was a graduate student. I was studying an invasive grass in some tropical lagoons on the Galapagos Islands. So I was very lucky. I did my master's at the Galapagos Islands. And there's this grass just taking over these lagoons. And I was like, why all of a sudden are these grasses taking over the lagoons? It's sort of a mystery. This is a terrible grass. It's changing these lagoons to terrestrial environment. But then if you read the history of the area, about 20 years earlier, the people who lived on this island built a road right along the beach and cut off the lagoon natural connection to the ocean. So we no longer had, with the tides, the natural flow of water in and out of the lagoons, changing the salinity levels, changing the water levels daily, and also on the lunar cycle. So now we had lower salinity and less variation in water fluctuation, and that allowed this grass to invade. And so a lot of the damage associated with the grass is probably due to the change in the hydrology, not so much the impact of the grass itself. So that's interesting.